That was Justin Towns Earl with Harlem River Blues, and you are listening to Wildside on Source 96.1 FM, and I'm your host, Caitlin Kight. And today, as the river theme suggests, we are going to be talking about water, and in particular, I'm going to be talking about wetlands. And this is a topic that I was inspired to address this week because I took a field trip on Monday to a local wetland, and that is the restoration project that's been ongoing up in Wadebridge. And it actually was quite a long-term project. It took 8 or 9 years, and they have this amazing bit of work that they've done to reclaim some old sections of wetland that had been used for pasture land and for recreation and other purposes, so that now they can be used by wildlife and to grow up native vegetation and to make the soil nice and rich and fertile. And it's just really an excellent place because you can do a lot of recreation now, but also enjoy the wildlife that the wetlands supports. And wetlands are really important, which is something we're going to talk about a lot today. And that's why I thought it actually would be quite nice to do a whole episode about these ecosystems, because it's something that you hear a lot about in terms of conservation. Excuse me. Because they are such a rich place, they have lots of biodiversity, and they're always kind of a hot topic because you have people often wanting to develop these areas. And so you have to kind of understand why they're so important and why it is that we do so often want to be in these kind of wetland areas and where the kind of human-nature conflict arises. So to start off with, it's kind of good, as I often do each week, to define the major topic. And you may have heard of the Ramsar Convention, which is an intergovernmental treaty that was made to protect wetlands and use them sustainably. It's several decades old at this point. And the Ramsar Convention offers kind of a very detailed definition of what a wetland is. So they say that it's an area of marsh, fen, peatland, or water, whether natural or artificial, permanent or temporary, with water that is static or flowing, fresh, brackish, or salt, including areas of marine water, the depth of which at low tide does not exceed 6 meters. So of course that is quite a long-winded and very detailed definition, and when you read that you don't really get a good sense of what is a wetland other than an area that has some water in it. So to put it into everyday terms, basically wetlands are areas that are saturated with water for long enough that they take on the characteristics of their own distinct ecosystem, so that you can kind of make predictions about how they're going to behave and what organisms you might find there, and what the soil and water conditions might be like in those areas. And actually there is a lot of variation, as that definition suggests, and this really depends on the lay of the land, the type and amount and predictability of the water flow. So something like a river might be a bit less predictable than something like the tides, because you don't have that kind of schedule that the tides are on. You might have a lot more flooding because of wind and rain events, and so you might not know exactly what's going to happen. Also, it depends on the type and amount of vegetation that's there, and also other things such as human activity. And of course, originally this was not something that helped define a wetland, but increasingly lots of human activity can alter the area and kind of really shape what the wetland will be like and how it will behave. And you can really broadly classify wetlands into 2 categories, as either tidal or non-tidal, but you can also classify them depending on what kind of vegetation they have. And this is really useful because one of the things that can help distinguish wetlands from other types of terrestrial or aquatic habitat is that they have certain characteristic vegetation that's quite adapted to the unique soil conditions of wetlands. So obviously if you're someone who keeps houseplants, you know that if you inundate your plants with water, they often don't survive. They die very quickly. This is something that is not an easy thing for plants to deal with, and so these species that occur in wetlands are very specially adapted. It's taken them quite a long time of living in these conditions to come up with these adaptations that allow them to thrive in these habitats, and so that's why they can be used to help classify what type of wetland you're looking at. So if you do this, you can kind of narrow it down into 4 main types of wetland. First of all, there are swamps, and these are forested wetlands, and they're considered either true swamps, which have large trees, or shrub swamps, which have kind of smaller hardwood trees and tend to occur in transitional areas between the more open kind of tidal flat sort of format and the more densely vegetated kind of foresty areas. And the largest swamp in the world is the Amazon River floodplain. But the Everglades, you'll probably have heard of, and also the Okefenokee swamps are other really important swampy areas in the New World. Closer to home, you might have heard of the Pripyat swamps in Belarus and Ukraine. And one of the reasons that these are kind of well known is that not only are they quite large and very close, but they're so impenetrable that they actually influenced the course of the Second World War, because you had troops that would get to the edge of them and they just couldn't get through because they were so impassable. You had people that would kind of go in and hide out there, and in fact there was a very large battle that eventually was fought where the troops went in and found all these people that had been hiding and they slaughtered them all at once. But it's a really massive place and quite hard to get around in. The next type of wetland area based on vegetation is a marsh. And these are dominated by herbaceous rather than woody plant species, so things like grasses and rushes and reeds. And in my area of the country, or pretty close to my area of the country back in the US, is the prairie pothole region, and this is a really famous marshy area. And this is made up of lots of little potholes, which are seasonal marshes that are created by glacial activity. This is not modern day glacial activity, but activity that happened way long ago. And these glaciers came down and created these ruts in the land, so they're slightly kind of shallow depressions. And most of the year they're just kind of grasses that grow there, but then periodically when the snows will melt and the rains will come, you'll get a buildup of water, and they flood and they make all these little they're called potholes, but they're like little ponds or little lakes, and they are amazing places for birds to live in. Another example of a marsh is the Camargue region in France, and that's something that I've actually recently read about quite a lot because I was doing research on flamingos, and flamingos are really common in this Camargue region. And also closer to home, the Morecambe Bay and Portsmouth area here in the UK both have some really famous and extensive marshes. So the other two types of wetland are ones that you guys in particular will be quite familiar with because they are very common here in the UK and down here in our neck of the woods, and these are bogs and fens. So bogs are highly acidic, low nutrient areas, and they have lots of different names. So they might also be called a mire, which actually in scientific terms is something that encompasses both bog and fen. They're sometimes called quagmires and muskegs, and they are in fact the most common form of wetland. And they make up about 30% of all the wetlands in the world. And the largest of these is found in Siberia, and it's absolutely massive. Of course, Siberia is as well, so it kind of is to scale. And actually one of the reasons it's been making the news lately is that it's been thawing for the first time in 11,000 years because of the warming temperatures around the globe. Also, again a bit closer to home, the Bog of Allen is another well-known bog here in Ireland. The Max Bog is a site of special interest near Winscombe in Avon, and in general there are just lots and lots of bogs that are found across Europe, so they are very common in this area in particular. They do quite well in northern habitats. There's just the right mix of conditions to make these. And fens are actually quite similar to bogs, as you might expect, given the fact that these are both often kind of grouped together under the name mire. But the thing that really distinguishes fens from bogs is that they generally have neutral or alkaline waters. So they can sometimes be acidic, but they're more commonly neutral, or they're a bit on the basic side. And they do actually have lots of minerals, as opposed to bogs, which don't have a whole lot of nutrients. But they don't really have a whole lot to sustain plants. So even though they have lots of these things in the water, it's not the kind of thing that plants need in order to grow. And these are generally dominated by grasses and sedges and also some brown mosses. So they're not the most colorful and kind of vegetated of all of these different types of wetland. But they are, in fact, the second most common form, so they make up about just over a quarter of all of the wetlands in the world. And this is something that, again, you guys are probably quite familiar with living around here. You might have heard of the Wicken Fen, and this was actually the National Trust's very first nature reserve ever created. And it's also considered to be one of Europe's most important fens, and in fact areas in general, because it's home to about 8,400 species throughout the course of the year. Now, in case you're curious about the difference between bogs and fens, other than what I already mentioned about kind of the pH level and the nutrient content, is that they do have quite a lot of overlap, but one of the main things, other than those two things that can help identify these, is where they're located. So bogs tend to be a bit higher than the surrounding landscape, and they get a lot of their water from the rain. But fens tend to be found on slopes and flats and depressions, and they get their water from both rainfall and under the surface, so water that's kind of moving through the soil, and they can collect it and grow that way. And both of these things are characterized by peat, which is an accumulation of dead plant material that's often comes from mosses like sphagnum moss. Now, you can subclassify these, but don't worry, I'm not going to go into them. But just so you know, you can also have other types of kind of subgroups of these categorizations, and these things include mangroves, cars, bacosans, and varzias. And cumulatively, all these types of wetlands occur naturally on every single continent, except obviously Antarctica, where the water isn't really in the form of a wet sort of substance, but in fact a frozen substance. But they can be found everywhere else. And overall, they are responsible for covering about 6% of the Earth's land surface, which doesn't really sound like all that much, except that in the places where they are found, they do lots of really important activities. So as we'll discuss in more detail, they do have a disproportionately important role in the planet's ecology because of all of the stuff that they do, and the home that they provide for all sorts of organisms. And that was the band with Up on Cripple Creek. And today on Wildside we are talking about wetlands. So before the break I mentioned that there are lots of different types of wetlands. And now I want to go into the ecology of wetlands in a bit more detail. So obviously one of the things that defines a wetland is the fact that it is wet and has certain water conditions that you can expect. So wetlands can be found in association with lots of different types and sources of water. And some of them receive water only from rain or from deep underwater sources, while others receive water from more permanent bodies that are more visible. So things like rivers and lakes and other kind of bodies of water that you can visit on a regular basis because you know they're there and you know when and where they're going to be. And you can describe wetlands based on some of these associations. So a palestrine wetland is one that's isolated, and it's an inland wetland that's lacking flowing water. So these are going to be the ones that are using water sources often from below the ground, a reservoir of water that's underneath the surface. Then you've got riverine wetlands that are associated with streams, things like creeks and actual rivers, of course. And lacustrine wetlands are ones that are associated with lakes or with reservoirs or other kind of pond-like bodies of water. And the source and flow of water are quite important for a wetland because they determine the mineral content and also the pH. So not just how many minerals are there, but what types of minerals are there and what sorts of vegetation these things are therefore going to be able to support. And so they also are influencing not just the water itself, but the soil quality, and then, as I mentioned, the things that will take root in that soil, and then all of the other things that will come in and live off of the vegetation. So all of this is quite important, and it goes back to the water itself that is helping to form these wetland areas. Now, as I mentioned, the water can really have a huge impact on soil conditions. And wetlands are characterized by having a type of soil that's called hydric. And what this means is that it spends so long underwater during the growing season that the upper layer will eventually become anaerobic. Or in other words, what happens is that you've got the microbes in the soil using up all the oxygen while they're growing, and you've got the plants taking up all the oxygen that the bacteria aren't using, and together they end up depleting the oxygen content in that soil. And so this upper layer completely no longer has any oxygen left, and that can really influence what can grow there and the kind of quality of the soil. And the major nutrient that's cycled in wetlands is carbon, which is why these areas are so important in terms of conservation and climate change, and that's why it's a real issue if people want to go in and develop wetlands, because they're going to prevent sequestration of carbon, which is really important for making sure there's not too much in the atmosphere, and it's also going to change the cycling of carbon, so it will affect how it flows on to other organisms. And we've talked about that in the past on this show, so I'm not going to go into lots of detail about the carbon cycle. But basically it's just that these areas are huge carbon sinks, and so they can hold all of this carbon in place, which we want them to do given how much we're releasing into the atmosphere. But when we disturb them, they are releasing lots of carbon, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to happen. Now, wetland plants, of course, the next step up, so you've got the water impacting the soil, which impacts the plants, And aquatic plants are often also called hydrophytes or macrophytes. And these are the plants that I mentioned earlier that are able to tolerate submersion permanently or for extended periods of time. And as I said, this is not something that's an easy thing to do. We know that most of the plants that we take care of in our gardens or in our homes tend to not do very well if we overwater them. And so there are very particular adaptations that these plants have developed over the years to allow them to live and actually thrive in these wetland areas. So one example is something called a rhynchoma, and these are spaces or air channels that will allow the movement of gases through the plant. And in particular, what happens is that you've got aerated portions of the plant that are able to get gases to the parts that are trapped below the water. So I'll discuss in a minute the fact that some plants in a wetland are going to be rooted in the soil, and others are just going to be floating in the water and have kind of maybe above water roots or roots that kind of dangle in the water. But either way, they're going to run out of oxygen pretty quickly because of that hydric soil quality, as I mentioned, but also because a lot of wetland areas tend to be kind of stagnant, and so they don't have a whole lot of influx of new oxygen. And so these plants are not able to get a whole lot of new oxygen all the time. But they're able to take advantage of these erynchyma so that the bits that are above the surface and exposed to oxygen up there can take in the gas through their leaves and then pass it down through these channels into the portions of the plant that otherwise wouldn't be exposed. And that's obviously quite a nifty little adaptation to have. Another thing, you'll often find the form of the plant is such that it facilitates these things doing quite well even when there's a lot of water. So they tend to be floating. Obviously having gases within them can help with floating, but also being untethered can help them kind of float around a bit more. They tend to have finely dissected leaves, which again is quite helpful if they start to have water flow too much over the leaves. Then if you've got lots of little leaves that are very fine, fern-like, then that's going to be less likely to be submerged, and they have just a better balance on the water surface that way. And in fact, you can classify aquatic plants into four main groups depending on kind of how they interact with the water. So the first group is submerged plants, which are found completely under the surface of the water, and these are going to be things like seagrass and eelgrass. You've also got floating water plants, and these are predominantly found in slow-moving water or water that's completely still. And one of the most famous of these, I actually just saw some the other day when I was walking near a wetland, is duckweed. And duckweed is the smallest known flowering plant. And you can kind of mistake it for algae if you're not looking closely because it just forms that kind of green surface. But if you do look closely, you'll see that it's lots of tiny little leaves. And people argue about whether or not the thing that it produces for reproduction is actually a flower, but I think most people do agree that it is, and it is absolutely tiny because the duckweed itself is quite small. And you find these in pretty much any part of any little bit of water that isn't moving all that much. So I saw it, for example, here in Falmouth underneath the viaduct where the train runs over. There's a little pond there, and it's just absolutely covered with duckweed. So another type of plant is the emergent water plant, and these guys have submerged roots, but the other bits of them are seen above the surface. And this is probably the most common, or at least it's the type that we see, for obvious reasons, the most. And so a really famous example of this is papyrus. And papyrus is a type of sedge that has been used for lots of different purposes over the course of human history. So the Egyptians famously used it for food, to make paper, to build boats. You often now see it planted, especially here in the UK, as an ornamental. You'll find it in lots of really nice kind of ornamental gardens. And papyrus is found in vast amounts in Africa along the Nile, and so that's why it does kind of have this place in human history. If you see a lot of decorations that are kind of in an Egyptian style, you almost always will see some papyrus and some reeds in the wetland area to kind of give you a sense of Egypt and the Nile area. Another famous type of emergent water plant is watercress, and this is actually one of the oldest known leaf vegetables consumed by humans. It's something that I never ate all that much in the US, but of course here in the UK you do find cress in a lot of different stuff. And it has hollow stems that allow the plant to float, and that's why we're able to see it in order to harvest it. And perhaps one of the most impressive emergent water plants is the Amazon water lily. These guys are really common in the UK because the Victorians absolutely loved them, and they cultivated them in gardens. And in fact, they competed for status using their Amazon water lilies. So whoever had the largest and most beautiful water lily was considered to be quite a good botanist and to have quite a nice property. And supposedly these were the inspiration for the Crystal Palace. So these things have leaves that are up to 3 meters in diameter, and they have these giant white flowers that are up to 40 centimeters in diameter. And they start out white, but then on the second day onwards they're pink. And so they're really beautiful, and they're kind of multicolored depending on when you see them. And if you've ever seen pictures of the Amazon where you have these little birds that are walking across the leaves because they have these giant feet that allow them to balance, those are Amazon water lilies that they're walking across, those massive kind of leaves that are like giant serving platters almost. And the final group of vegetation, which is not quite as exciting as these Amazon water lilies, I'm afraid, are just the trees and shrubs that you tend to find with swamps and mangrove type areas. And these guys are also going to be very water tolerant, obviously, because most of the time they do have, they are submerged through the entire year. Although sometimes there are trees that in certain areas will be on the fringes enough that they do experience periods where it's dried out and they're kind of living basically on regular land. These will include things like cypress trees. That's what you see in the American South when you have all those visuals of the swamp. You're going to be seeing cypress trees with their little knees sticking up out of the water and the moss is hanging down off the branches. Also mangroves, I already mentioned. I'll talk a little bit later about how mangroves especially are really important as areas to allow little fish and baby fish to thrive, because mangroves have all these little branches that dangle down into the water, and they're very complex kind of root systems that allow these little fish to kind of hide out and find a nice sanctuary from other organisms that would want to eat them. And the last thing I want to mention is it's not a plant, but it's also very notable in these wetland habitats, and that's algae. And you can see tons of algae in pretty much every wetland. And these guys play a really important role in the ecosystem because they serve as habitat, they serve as food, and they play a really important role in cycling nutrients and just kind of keeping the wetland functioning in the way that wetlands do. So they're one of the really important kind of foundation organisms in a wetland habitat. That was Roscoe Holcomb with the Mississippi Heavy Water Blues. And before the break, I was talking about some of the organisms that can be found in wetlands and some of the things that kind of characterize wetland habitats. And the last thing on that list is wetland animals. And when I think of wetlands, the first thing I always think of is waterfowl. And obviously I am a bit obsessed with birds, I admit that, but wetlands are really famous for their waterfowl because they do support huge populations of them and play a really important role in keeping these populations healthy and in the condition for breeding. And often it's because they're offering food for breeding, sometimes it's because they're offering habitat for breeding. So they just play a really integral role in the life of many different types of waterfowl. But also they're really important for passerines, so things like reed and sedge warblers, things like raptors, so for example ospreys and eagles that will be eating a lot of fish, and of course other birds that will prey on items in the wetlands, so gulls, herons, even owls. So I worked for a couple of summers in some really intensely wetland areas, and these environments were really crazy to try to travel through on foot. You know, you're out there in waders trying to make your way through. But one of the things that we would do is we would boat around and check these barn owl boxes that were on poles. And the barn owls love to nest in these nest boxes because the opening faces out over water, which means that there aren't too many predators that can come and attack them. They can't be caught unawares. And so barn owls will love to find old snags, or of course if there are any human types of nest boxes, they'll use those as well because it's a very safe environment for them to raise their young in. And of course these sorts of animals are able to live there because wetlands are vital areas for fish, and they can act as hatcheries and also nurseries, including for some species that are of really important ecological and commercial value. So for example, some researchers have estimated that about 75% of U.S. fish stocks rely at some stage of their lives on wetlands, and in particular at their younger stages of growth, when it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, for them to find a place to kind of take shelter from the larger things that would try to eat them. Now, reptiles and amphibians are something that you often will also think of. If someone says wetland, the first thing you might picture is an alligator or a crocodile. These, of course, are really popular tourist attractions, especially, I always tend to associate them with the American South and the Everglades. And I have, in fact, seen some of these things in the American South. And so they do kind of give a bit of flavor to these wetland habitats. But there are lots of other species as well. So frogs, for example, are used as indicators of wetland health. And you hear frogs, I mean, if you go to a wetland, you're going to just hear the cacophony of frogs up in the trees and down by the banks. And because these guys have really thin skins that allow them to absorb nutrients and toxins, then they can be used to show where and when pollution is occurring. And so you often will have a lot of toxins that are dissolved in water, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And so these frogs can be really great to study if you find them there or not, or if they're not very healthy versus if they are quite healthy, if they're showing mutations, that sort of thing. They can be a really good indication of the health of the wetland ecosystem. And wetlands in general are home to a variety of mammals, even though this is not at all the first group that I think most of us tend to think about. So you have species like muskrats and actual rats and nutrias and all these little things that will kind of swim through the water. And a really important species is the beaver, which in fact is really important for creating and perpetuating a lot of wetland ecosystems. So beavers in the US, for example, they had been really persecuted and killed off, and in areas they just stopped creating new wetlands, and this had a huge impact on the habitat because these guys were responsible for gnawing down trees and damming off areas and flooding whole new fields. And so without beavers in the equation, it really changed the landscape a whole lot. So there are lots of these little things that we tend not to think of. There even really large species like lions you can find in lion in American terms, but panthers that you'll find, for example, in the Everglades. So wetlands actually can support quite large apex organisms as well. And of course, humans have been found to use wetlands over the course of history. We tend not to like them because of the insects, because obviously things like mosquitoes and gnats and midges are quite unpleasant. But the areas can offer a lot of protection from enemies. And I mentioned earlier with the case of World War II, how there were these people that were seeking refuge in the wetland. And in fact, that is something that's been known to happen over the course of history. You'd have people living along the banks of a river, and so they're right there where the wetland area is, kind of where the water meets the upland. And they would often use these places as sanctuaries to go hide anytime someone would come raiding or attacking them. And speaking of insects, these of course are really important. They're thought to account for over half of the 100,000 or so known animal species in wetlands, and they're not to be trivialized because they are so important for keeping the ecosystem going. You know, they provide so much food to all the other organisms that are there, and they can really help with cycling the nutrients around. They're one of the reasons that wetlands often have a bad name, and especially because they can transmit diseases. And one of the really funny things, thinking about humans and humans using wetlands, is that we tend to target these areas that used to be wetlands and try to develop them. So for example, New Orleans or Washington, D.C. in the US, these areas actually make terrible places. Even New York City used to be a wetland area. And you do not want to have to build in these areas because they're just saturated with water and you're always having to worry about flooding. But we tend to target these habitats, and then we complain later on when they have lots of mosquitoes and other bugs that thrive because they like these kind of wet habitats. So it's kind of ironic that this is the case. Now, despite all this sort of complaint that I ended on here about wetlands, they do have massive value. And this is cultural value and ecosystem value, but also just kind of in general, they do lots of really important things economically as well. And if you think about it, you can kind of classify the function and the value of these things depending on certain aspects. So for example, if you think about the functions of wetlands related to hydrology. So one of the really important things that they do is control floods and lessen the likelihood of a really bad flood. And they do this because they can slow runoff, so all the water that's moving through has to, it crashes into all those plants and all that soil that's built up, and it has to make its way through that before it can then get to humans and start flooding through the landscape. So wetlands can slow the runoff and prevent it from spreading out into nearby habitats. And even when the water does kind of flow over and invade those floodplains, having the wetlands there will ensure that the flooding is at least going to be shallower and less intense. So in general, it reduces the power of the water that's going to be doing the flooding, and so lessens the impact of those floods on the nearby areas. It's also really important for replenishing the groundwater. So in addition to the water that occurs at the surface of wetlands, so the stuff that we see kind of in pond format, for example, there's a lot that's held in place below the ground, in the soil and in the plants themselves. And this will filter down through the soil and into underground aquifers. And some of this happens more in some places than in others, but it is still really important because where it does happen, it recharges stores of drinking water. And we put huge pressure on underwater aquifers and other sources of water. So having the wetlands there to help replenish the water and bring back up the supply so that we can use it again is really, really helpful. And there are actually some wetlands that are particularly good at this. So there's a type of wetland called the karst cave system, and these things are associated with massive changes in the water table. So a variation of depth of approaching like 130 meters, so well over 100 meters, all of that being water thanks to these wetlands. So that just shows you what a huge contribution they can make to the stuff that's available for us to use. And what's great about this also is that not only is there water that's being moved through, but it's also being purified when that happens. Because the vegetation will retain the nutrients and it will trap sediments and it will remove toxins. So by the time it moves through the wetlands and down through the water into the aquifers, it's in very good condition and you can actually almost go down and just drink straight from those areas. I'm not recommending that because they aren't 100% good at this, but it's amazing what a difference it makes, and we don't have to do much processing after that to get it ready for human consumption. Something else that these things do is really stabilize the shoreline, and this is something that we found out to our detriment how very important this is. This in addition with flood control during Hurricane Katrina a few years ago. So what they do is they basically provide a buffer against tidal action and against storms. And just like you see with flood control inland, the wetlands that are on tidal areas, they'll reduce the speed and the height of waves so that they're reaching the shore with less power. So in the instance of Hurricane Katrina, you had these horrible waves coming in from the ocean, from the Gulf area, but you've also got floods coming down from the river. And so had there been more wetlands in place, there could have been more flood control and more shoreline stabilization occurring simultaneously, and that really could have helped protect the city. So these things actually have a really important impact. It's not a negligible difference that these make. And lots of people have said, even just a few more meters of wetland space would have made a noticeable impact on what happened in New Orleans when the storm hit. Now, I've already mentioned several times that wetlands are really important for increasing and sustaining biodiversity of wildlife. And they're important to some species at all times, so there are some organisms that will live their entire lives in a wetland ecosystem. But then they're also important to other species that will come in and leave again during very sensitive life stages. And wetlands are considered the most biologically diverse of all the ecosystems on the planet. And there are hundreds of new species that are still discovered each year in wetlands that are being studied. So for example, even just looking at fish alone, there are over 200 fish that are discovered in wetlands each year, even now after all these years of studying them. And so of course, this issue is a real focal point for conservationists because there are so many species and sometimes quite small areas of space. So there are high levels of endemism, so that means you've got species that are found only there, and also very high levels of productivity because all these things are working together to produce. They're very tightly correlated, the health of one with the health of another, and so they are really important for the habitat. And one issue is not just the total number of species that you've got in wetlands, but also the genes that are found within those species. So there was some recent work on Lake Baikal in Russia, and they found that this area is more important than maybe any other in the world probably any other in the kind of Europe-Asia area, for holding diversity of genes and particular alleles and traits that are not found in similar populations anywhere else. And that's because you can have these wetland ecosystems that are quite isolated from each other, and so they tend to just have traits that will evolve, they'll adapt to that local habitat, and they aren't found anywhere else, even though you've got a similar population, a similar species found somewhere else down the road. And so it is really important to kind of keep these places healthy so that that gene flow can be enhanced, for instance, by migration or by kind of moving animals from one place to another, so that we can make sure that those traits remain in the population and will help the animals should they need to kind of adapt more and more in the future. And of course I mentioned earlier that wetlands do have really important cultural value as well. It's not all just about looking at biology. So a lot of people go out and do recreation in wetlands. There's a lot of tourism, and of course tourism especially, but also recreation, they're tied up with economics. So wetlands provide food and traditional medicines depending on where you are in the world. A lot of people will use some of the wetland plants for fibers and also dyes. They're extremely important as a source of revenue from bird watching and boating and fishing and agriculture and all sorts of things. So especially if you consider the fact that rice paddies are basically a wetland, you can imagine just how important they are for food and for the money associated with rice crops. Also, amazingly, artificial wetlands have even been constructed for the purpose of managing wastewater. And I know that doesn't sound very appealing, but it's really impressive the kind of job that these wetlands are doing. So in Calcutta, for example, there is a green Ramsar wetland area that incorporates lots of different features. So it has canals and agricultural plots for kind of small veggie sort of growing, rice paddies and also fish ponds. And this whole complex gives people jobs. So something like 20,000 people have jobs that are associated with those aspects of the wetland. But also, it gets rid of refuse, so you can take all of your kind of composty types of garbage and toss them in the wetland, and it will process them. They'll get broken down and used as kind of fertilizer. And it also processes human sewage. And apparently, this can take care of almost all of the refuse and sewage associated with the entire city of Calcutta, while also giving these jobs to some 20,000 people and producing things that can be utilized elsewhere. So it's a really amazing kind of system that you've got going. And if you can have lots of those, then you can imagine the huge savings that there could be, because wastewater management is not a cheap thing. So if we have lots of these little functional wetlands, it's potentially a really good compromise for keeping and preserving a wetland habitat, but also getting some human use out of the land. And one last thing I want to mention before we have another music break is that human settlements often do emerge near bodies of water. I kind of referred to this earlier. And so you tend to have some really interesting kind of cultural artifacts that are found in these areas. And wetlands tend to have lots of important artifacts kind of on the mummified body side of things. So they do sometimes contain kind of implements that have been tossed in or have fallen in at some point, or maybe even some old petrified posts from old homes and that sort of thing. But potentially the most interesting thing, maybe it's just me because I'm kind of weird, but you tend to find these mummified bodies, especially in peat bogs. And these are actually referred to as bog bodies, so they have an actual term. And people have studied these to find out lots of really interesting things about people over the several thousand years over which these things have been found. And they're particularly common in Northern Europe because, as I said earlier, the conditions are right in Europe for these sorts of habitats, and there are lots of them. And the oldest body that's been found is the Kolbjerg woman from Denmark, and she's been dated to about 8,000 BCE, but most of the others are from the Iron Age. And in fact, many bodies seem to have been deliberately deposited in wetlands, and people have suggested that maybe this was a good place to get rid of bodies because they would decompose relatively quickly, and they could be used kind of, as I said, like a fertilizer sort of situation. So it's just a wealth of knowledge associated with wetlands, not just their ecosystem function, but also what we can find out about human history. And that was Audre May with The River. And we have been talking about wetlands today, and I have referred a little bit to the fact that humans do disturb wetlands and have some negative impacts on them, but now I want to talk about that a bit more specifically and directly. So a recent assessment found that wetlands suffer more degradation than any other ecosystem on the planet, despite the fact that they only make up about 6% of all the ecosystems on the planet. And a lot of this has to do with alterations to hydrology. So we have unsustainable water use, we drain them, we put in dams upstream and prevent water from coming down and forming wetlands, and we also make modifications to the shoreline, especially in tidal areas. And we tend to narrow channels as well and force the same amount of floodwater through less space, and this causes floods to be more rapid and more intense. And this is one of the big reasons why wetlands are actually quite nice, is because they prevent this kind of rapidity and intensity, as I mentioned a bit earlier. And so we're having a lot of negative impacts on hydrology, especially in association with wetlands, but also independently of wetlands, but the stuff that we're doing could actually be mitigated by the presence of these types of habitat. And another thing that we do is we alter the biodiversity. So we introduce invasive species, we remove native species. A great example of this actually is something that I saw recently when I was in Kenya on the field course with the university. Lake Naivasha is a place that has, it's just completely surrounded by flower farms, and they're draining a lot of the water, which is obviously quite a problem. But another big issue is the fact that invasive species like the water hyacinth have been introduced, and they just cover massive areas of the lake, and you can actually see these things. They float on the water and you can see them blowing around on the surface, and they clog up the channels so that people out on boats can't get through very well, and it's just a huge problem. And this is the sort of thing that we have happening in lots of different lakes and wetland areas around the world, actually. And in fact, the most endangered of all wetland species are turtles. And these are both marine and freshwater turtles. And that's followed by reptiles, and then mammals, and then fish. So all of these guys are really having serious issues, having to compete with these introduced things that have been brought in, but also they're being killed off because there's not enough vegetation, or there are contaminants, or whatever the case may be. So kind of on that topic, soil and water quality are affected by the fact that we do mining, and there's contamination, there's an imbalanced sediment load because of changing of all of this water flow can alter how much sediment's being moved around. And you tend to find that the buildup of toxins in wetland areas can be spread up the food chain and impact species that are living along the wetlands, but also actually quite far inland as well. So these things can have really big cascading effects. But potentially the worst problem for wetlands is development. And this is something that's actually expected to increase, particularly along the coast, because tons of people live on the coast now. We've had massive increases in how many people live there, and it's expected to continue increasing over the next several years. And so we tend to go in and we drain these areas in order to do construction, or we flood them in order to create lakes for recreational purposes or to drink the water. And when you tie development in with all these other issues, then you've got problems with runoff and sedimentation and contaminants and availability of habitat, and just all these things that are kind of compounding each other. But of course, luckily we do know a lot about wetland conservation, and people have been engaged in wetland conservation for quite a long time and have kind of worked out some techniques that seem to do quite well. You can prevent, of course, the destruction of wetlands altogether, and that's probably your best target because you want to keep this habitat around in its current form. But you can also improve and restore damaged wetlands, and that's what happened in this area that I visited on Monday, the Camel Valley Wetland Restoration Project. You can kind of just allow these areas to revert to what they used to look like before we went in and kind of made modifications for agriculture or building or whatever. But you can also create artificial wetlands. And this is something that's quite tricky to do, and we're still kind of trying to perfect this technique. It can take a really long time for them to begin to look like native wetlands, and to have the correct species assemblages, to have soil quality that's appropriate, so they tend not to have hydric soil the way that they should. It's just got an imbalance of what nutrients are in the soil. And you can plant particular types of vegetation, but they may not thrive or persist or grow in natural patterns. And actually there have been studies that have shown that even though the birds, for example, will come in and settle these unnatural kind of created places, they don't use them in quite the same way. So they may not be quite as abundant. They may not actually use them for breeding the way that you might want them to. So it is a really tricky thing to try to get the balance correct. But this is a really popular area of research, and there are lots of people struggling and working quite hard to figure out exactly what needs to be done in order to help preserve these habitats and return them into their natural state, or to create them if we need to put them in where they haven't been before. So for example, that great case study of what's happening in Calcutta, to kind of build one from scratch basically. So hopefully that means that in the future, as we continue to recognize the importance of wetlands and kind of build our skills with working with them, we'll figure out the right way to kind of conserve these areas and create them if necessary. And if you're interested in seeing some wetlands in the UK, The Guardian actually developed a list of the top 4, and these include the WWT London Wetlands Centre, Minsmere in Suffolk, the Clay Marshes in Norfolk, and the Shapwick and Mere Heaths in Somerset, as well as the Carlaverock Wetlands Centre, I've probably horribly mispronounced that, I'm sorry, in Dumfries and in Galloway. But of course, if you're closer to home, there are lots of examples as well. So Bodmin Moor, which has wonderful mires, and in the vicinity of Lostwithiel, you can find some intertidal salt marsh. The Colne grassland is a really great place because they have some relatively threatened species that can't be found too many other places. And also the Goss Moor, which is the source of our own river fowl and supports the largest inland wetland in all of Cornwall. So there are lots of wetland areas for you to explore, both here and around the country. And if you explore them and kind of show your support for them, then that will help them be preserved in the future. So hopefully you feel that you know a bit more about these ecosystems now and kind of appreciate what they do for you. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and end with a bit of Ben Howard singing Oats in the Water, but I'm afraid I've cut it kind of close, so you're probably not going to hear too much of this. But I'll put all this information, as always, up on the Wildside website, so check it out on source.co.uk.